And we're live. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours. My name is Joyce, and I'm a community manager here at Codementor. I'm also joined by Valentine, and she's also a community manager here. So I'm sure you all have a ton of questions for our guests today. So throughout this broadcast, feel free to ask the questions through the YouTube live chat window right next to this video. And we'll try and get to all of them, but we do have limited time today. So today I'm really excited to be joined by Jules Kremer, Stephen Fluen, and Rob Wormald from the Google Angular team. So to start us off with, can you guys tell us a little about your role on the Angular team and sort of what your day-to-day looks like?
Jules, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm Jules, and I manage our developer relations team here at Google. My day-to-day varies depending on where we are in terms of are we doing a big release like Angular 2, in which case I'm pretty much working with press and our messaging, or are we working with JavaScript developers who need support, or things like this, outreach to our community and helping people understand Angular better, or working on internal plans and process to make our engineering efforts even better. Stephen.
So Stephen Fluen, I'm a developer advocate on Jules' team here at Google. I really think about my day-to-day job as kind of two parts. The first part is talking to developers, building and writing things that help them be successful. And then the second half is representing their needs, understanding, listening, and then kind of going back to the team internally and saying, hey, this is what they're asking for. These are the problems they're running into, so that we can build the best product possible.
I'm Rob Wormald. I'm also a developer advocate here at Google, and my day-to-day is more or less the same as Stephen's day-to-day. Sort of half our time is out there talking to the world, talking to developers, helping them, doing talks, and then the other half is bringing that feedback back to the core team. So.
Thanks a lot for this. We've had quite a few questions about the level of adoption for Angular 2. So how do you see the adoption happening among existing users? Do you see it happening quickly, slowly? And also, do you expect it to replace completely Angular 1 down the line?
So it's an interesting question that we, as developer advocates, when we look at how we determine success for our team and our individual roles, we sort of think, well, how's adoption? What are the numbers? The unfortunate truth is we don't really have a lot of metrics that can give us a really, really, really clear view of adoption. And that's in part because depending on how you're using Angular 2, for example, we may or may not even be able to determine if you were using Angular 2 when your website was created. But secondarily, a lot of Angular usage is not just public websites. A lot of it is internal line of business apps that we have no visibility into what they're using. So traditionally, we've used the number of 30-day actives to our doc site, to the angular.io/docs or angular/doc site. And I think, and I didn't actually look at the numbers before this call, but I think Brad mentioned yesterday they were up around 700,000 for Angular 2, and at Angular Connect, there was about 1.2 on Angular 1. How many of the Angular 2 users are new, greenfield, and how many are Angular 1 migrating over, we can't be sure, but those are the numbers that we primarily use to estimate Angular usage. And the second question you asked was if we think Angular 2 will eventually completely replace Angular 1, and I hope so, just so that we can continue to make Angular 2 awesome, but we will, of course, support Angular 1 as long as the majority of our developers are still there.
Thanks so much for that.
It's not going to go away anytime soon, right? Like Angular 1 will be around forever as Backbone and jQuery and everything else has been around forever. So.
Thanks. Okay. So we've got a question sent in by Chris via email, and Chris was asking about the incentive to move from Angular 1 to Angular 2 if one's focus is on relatively simple apps that aren't going to be built at an enterprise level?
I think that for me, there are a couple of things. And I think this applies whether you're an indie sort of independent developer, right, or you're a big org of 5,000 people. I think that the two biggest things are performance and tooling. And I think those are the two things that we kind of talk about the most. So performance, right, obviously Angular 2 is going to be significantly faster in pretty much all cases. And I think that's good for everybody, right? One of the things that we found with tooling, though, is things like having TypeScript and having auto-completion and having type checking in your templates all of these things are great, especially if you're an indie developer. It makes it easier to learn the framework, right? It makes it easier to check your errors. It makes the whole thing easier to work with. So I think probably just like perf and just general like usability, I think, are the two biggest sort of takes for any Angular 1 dev.
Yeah, I was actually starting a new project this weekend, just a small website that I wanted to build for to help a friend out. And I started doing it in Angular 1, thinking, oh, I'm going to go back to the easy way of doing things. But what ended up happening was I wanted a bunch of things, right? I wanted to use TypeScript. I wanted to minify my bundles. I wanted to just kind of ship this very small, sleek JavaScript. And it was actually harder to do that in Angular 1 than it was Angular 2, because what we've kind of done in Angular 2 is we've reacted and responded to the evolution of the web as a platform. And so Angular 2 is actually a simpler framework, but it takes advantage of things like module loading, and it allows you to take advantage of the best of the web as it is in 2016 and beyond.
Nice, thank you so much. So I guess you've also answered to one of the main questions that came from the audience, which was they were wondering if there was a risk if they stick with Angular 1 in the medium to long run. So in terms of support, and also because technically it's outdated since Angular 2 is out. So you really think that Angular 1 it won't be a problem for people having apps with Angular 1?
No, I mean, with over 1 million developers building apps in Angular 1 is not going anywhere for a while. I mean, the web runs on Angular 1 a little bit from some perspective today.
1.6 is coming out pretty soon here, and they're already talking about 1.7 of Angular 1. So it's not like it's dead on the vine, right? Like it's very much still being actively developed by their team.
But the thing I'll say is, you mentioned this kind of idea of building something for the long term. And what ends up happening is we talk to developers every day that are building in Angular 1, and they end up saying kind of the same things over and over, which is, hey, I need to get more performance out of my application. I want to do more advanced techniques like splitting it into lazy loaded bundles. I want to do server-side rendering. And all of those problems, we kind of chuckle when we hear those from Angular 1 developers, because this is part of why we built Angular 2, is to solve those problems.
Okay, thanks. That's clear. And speaking of moving to Angular 2, are there any tips or best practices that you would like to share for migrating apps from Angular 1 to Angular 2?
I think that if you haven't done our tutorial on the website, I think that's a really, really awesome place to start.
Okay.
The Docs team has done a huge amount of work on really like taking you through the story of building an Angular 1 or an Angular 2 application. And I think that that's a really, really good place to start. They're quite conscious in that to talk about, like, if you're an Angular 1 developer, right, and you do things this way, this is how they work in Angular 2. So that's a really, really, really good place to start. And then, of course, all of the partners we work with, and people are writing really good blogs and really good posts and all of these different things. But I think our docs are always a really good place to start. We put a huge amount of effort into making them approachable for people.
Okay. Arun asked on the, are you talking?
Oh, no, sorry.
Sorry, there was a delay in my video. Arun asked on the live chat, when do you expect a stable release? Is that?
Of Angular 2?
Yeah,
we released Angular 2 final.
In September. Yes, it was, right? Okay, I was just to make sure, because that was asked on the chat. And okay.
I mean, I'll kind of expand on that further, because this is one of the important things to understand.
Yeah, that would be great.
Is we've actually switched to a couple things. We announced that we started using semantic versioning, which means that we're being very intentional and very specific about how we use numbers to indicate the size and the impact of change. So, and then the other half of that is that we've announced a release cadence that we're trying to achieve. So since the release of Angular 2.0.0, we've actually been releasing a patch update every week, or about every week. And then we're actually working on the next minor update. So we're actually working right now on getting Angular 2.1 out the door. Last week we pushed out Angular 2.1 RC0. And so developers are going to have a ton more predictability in terms of what to expect and when to expect breaking changes. So we're actually not expecting, or we're intentionally delivering no breaking changes between now and next year.
Okay, because that was also something that was asked. Between now and next year, there won't be some major changes. But then on, Sabi was wondering, someone who asked on Twitter, if they should expect disruptive changes in the future regularly, like twice a year or so. After that,
our policy is going to be that every 6 months we'll do a major release.
Okay.
And what we're saying with major releases is that they may contain breaking changes, but wherever possible, we are going to make them backwards compatible. So meaning that if we introduce a change in version 3, right, that will not break version 2, and you will have a set amount of time to migrate your changes off. So we will overlap new features and old features so that you have time to migrate.
Yeah, I think that the use of the word disruptive change was really interesting, because while we may have breaking changes in these kind of major releases, they won't be disruptive.
Okay, thanks. And so we've got also quite a few questions. Quite a few people were interested in the switch to TypeScript and the thought process behind that. Could you talk a little bit more about it, and whether you would recommend TypeScript to build a new project?
So if you don't know the history of Angular 2, one of the very interesting things that happened very, very early on in the process is the team decided initially that they were going to invent their own programming language, right? Which is basically insane. And the reason we did that is there are features that we wanted. There were things like the decorators that we use and type checking and all of these things that didn't really exist in JavaScript. And so initially we looked at this idea of sort of augmenting JavaScript, and this was AtScript or AtScript back in the day. Luckily, the TypeScript team sort of said, hey, we're doing a lot of the similar things that you're doing. And so really the initial sort of drive to TypeScript was both all the features that we wanted, right, the language didn't provide us. TypeScript then sort of said, hey, we can do all these things, right? And that means that the Angular team doesn't have to support a programming language, which is great. The benefit of all of the TypeScript ecosystem, right? And a huge team of really, really incredible people at Microsoft who work on that. I think from our perspective, I don't know that there's anybody on the Angular team who would choose to not use TypeScript today. I think that for most people, it's just an incredibly nice experience. It's what allows us to make Angular very small and very fast. And especially if you're new to Angular 2, getting TypeScript and getting things like auto-completion in your editor, right, are amazing because it allows you to understand Angular, right? It just makes you more efficient. And I think most people would agree. And we hear all the time from people who are a little bit intimidated by it, which I think is fair. And then inevitably, within a week or two, they come back to us and say, hey, this is really awesome. We really, really like TypeScript. So I think for everybody, we recommend at the very least, trying it out, right? Like give it a week, and most people, I think, stick with it and don't go back.
And if you don't like it, we do support ES6 and ES5 as well. But some of the more advanced optimization techniques you just can't do, because without the type annotations, you don't have that semantic understanding. And you also can't take advantage of some of the kind of nice to develop features that came in ES 2015, ES 2016, and so on.
Okay, thanks. So there's another question which asks, in respect to complementary frameworks and tools to Angular 2, such as Telerik and Progress, if you guys have any preference or places to investigate?
Preference, I think, is hard for us, but I think like there are a ton of really, really interesting projects already. I think NativeScript's a big one, right? What Teleg's doing is really interesting. The Ionic team have done a huge amount of amazing work. Ionic for Angular 1 was really amazing, and I think we've seen really, really amazing stuff on Angular 2 with them. Gosh, like we could list them all day, right? NG Bootstrap, Material, all of the component vendors, all of these sorts of things. I think the best place really is our docs site again. We have a resources page on there, which has a link to all of these complementary tools, frameworks, all these different things that work with Angular.
Yeah.
Angular.io/resources.
We've actually had that list since before the release. What we've seen since then, and I think because there's so much going on, we've even probably struggled to keep up with it, is everyone out there is building libraries for Angular 2 that kind of do everything you could imagine. So There's video players, there's maps, so I mean the ecosystem is really exploding in a way that it did with Angular 1, and so we're really happy to see that.
Just jumping in here, speaking of Angular Material, we had a Ashish from YouTube chat ask, when will Angular Material fully support NG2?
So the way the material is working, how many components do we have in there now? 20 odd, I think they're just about done, 20, 30?
Something like that, yeah. I know it's more than 18, I think.
Anyway, and I think that that's going to continue to evolve over the next months and months. I don't know that I can give you a release date. Jeremy would probably yell at me if I did that. But there's a lot of work happening on it. We've just augmented the team a bit for that, so there'll be more people working on Material, which is great. Part of the deal with Material is that we want to make sure that it is absolutely rock solid and it's accessible, right? It does all of the things right that you should be doing on the web. And that takes a little more time. The other part of that is that a lot of the underlying guts of Material, so things like stuff that drives accessibility and right to left and all of these different things, we're writing it in such a way that those things will be available to be used in other libraries as well. And again, that kind of engineering takes a little bit more work, a little bit more time. It's in alpha right now, and you are absolutely more than welcome to use those components as they exist today, with the warning that obviously they may change a little bit. But yeah, it's going to be something that will evolve over the long term, but we are very aware that there's a lot of demand for the Material components, both inside and outside of Google. So it's something that we're very much focused on now that the framework itself is stable.
I always go out on a little bit of a limb when I talk about Angular Material because I'm such a big fan, which is that it's labeled alpha, but it's really high quality, really good. It's just subject to change in the future. And obviously they don't have all the components that they dream about, but I mean, all of the components that I need on a daily basis, from card to toolbars to side nav drawers, things like that, input boxes, those already exist and those work well.
Great, thank you. We also had a question asking, the semantic versioning blog post you guys made suggests that Angular 3 will come out in Q1 of 2017. Is this true? And if it's true, how safe of an investment is Angular 2 for the years to come?
Yes, it's true when we're targeting that. And as we said a little bit earlier, I think that really what we're trying to achieve is a balance between continuing to evolve the framework, right, so that it doesn't go stagnant, it keeps up with the web, which evolves very quickly, but also guaranteeing that stability backwards, right? And I think that semantic versioning and our policy is really the best way we can see to maintain that, right? So we would like to say, and I think that we're confident saying, that it's a very good investment in the future. It will be nice to use now, and it will only get better and faster and stronger as we go.
I mean, we worked on Angular 2 for so long that the name actually ends up being a bit of a misnomer, where people think that Angular 2 or Angular 3 is, oh, I'm going to go after rewrite my applications again. And that's absolutely not the case. Moving from Angular 2 to Angular 3, it's going to be a semantic versioning update, which means it's a major update, which really means it's similar from my perspective of moving from Angular 1.4 to Angular 1.5, or if you were participating with us during the RC period, moving from Angular RC4 to RC5, right? We were actually had a higher rate of change, a higher rate of breaking changes pre-release, even month to month, than I expect to see from Angular now to Angular of next year.
And it should be said that I don't think anybody in the Angular team wants to ever do this again, right? I don't know that we ever want to rewrite the framework from scratch again. So we're pretty happy saying that we're just going to continue to evolve it, right, rather than rewriting it. Yeah.
I mean, we almost need new terms to talk about it. I wish there was an easier way, because we're trying very hard to drop the Angular 2 name, because it is going to be Angular 3, it's going to be Angular 4, but it's all part of that second generation of Angular, so to say.
Great. We have quite a few questions about, did you want to add something, Rob?
Yeah.
Okay. We had quite a few questions about Angular CLI. There's Tom emailed in asking, when will CLI get the new router?
That's a good question, actually. So this is a feature that we pulled out really early on in Angular CLI. It's actually like a really ridiculously hard problem to automatically do route creation. It's not something that's trivial. I know that the team is working on it right now. I think that we sort of took a detour to make things like our ahead-of-time compilation and lazy loading work really well in Webpack, and that was, again, a pretty hard problem to solve.
The other half of it that I would say is that what are you hoping for from the CLI in terms of routing? So when we talked to developers and we stacked up all the use cases of what they were hoping for from the CLI, the CLI wasn't actually creating a huge amount of value. I mean, adding new routes is actually relatively straightforward. So I mean, you create a component as normal, which the CLI definitely helps you do. It has all the scaffolding and all the generators for that. And then you add a single line of code to your routes file to say, hey, based on this URL prefix, this is the component I want to be served. And so finding ways that the CLI can add value, there's actually a little bit hard because people end up doing routing a little bit differently depending on kind of their style. Some people put it in modules. Some people just have a routing constant that they're passing around. Some people still dynamically generate these things. And so without, I mean, it's almost more work to use a CLI command than it is to just do it. And so we're trying to balance that difficulty and make sure that the CLI is being helpful and useful.
Okay, great. We also had a question. They're saying that they're a great fan of terminal usage and Angular CLI focuses on it, but all the tutorials are based on the seed project, which can be a good resource. What can be a good resource to find sort of learn more about the CLI version?
So it has a built-in help command, which you can throw into it and will spit back to you all of the possible commands and options and things like that. So that's a good place, like, you know, like any man command will tell you that. I believe there's an Angular CLI channel on Gitter as well. So it's gitter.im/angular/angular-CLI. That's a good place if you want to talk to people who are using it. They have English people hanging around there who can help you as well. Steven looks like he wants to say something.
Oh, I did. So, I mean, coming as an outsider, a newbie to the Angular CLI project, I understand this concept can be very scary, but I started taking a look at I was giving a presentation on the CLI at Angular Connect. I started digging into the source code of the Angular CLI, and it's actually very, very straightforward. There's actually like a commands folder if you look at the Angular CLI project on GitHub, and then for every command there is a single kind of JavaScript file, and then it shows all the options at the top, and then all the things it does. And it's kind of like the CLI is a magic thing. It does a ton of things for you and kind of just figures things out and makes things work. But under the hood, it's not doing anything complex. So I mean, it's relying on kind of best of breed tools like Webpack to do things like minification and production builds and things like that. And so all the CLI is doing under the hood is setting a few extra parameters and then running a scaffold or a blueprint deployment, or setting a few parameters and then passing that into Webpack. So it is far less mysterious than it kind of seems. And so while it definitely can seem scary, I would recommend taking a look at just the source code of the Angular CLI, because it can be very informational if you want to go past or you want to go deeper into what the CLI is doing, just to take a look at it directly.
I think that the same thing applies to the Angular code base as well. I think that the fact that it's written in TypeScript, like one of the best ways to learn what Angular is doing is to go read the source. And now that it's got TypeScript right and it's documented, it's really, I think in general, easily understandable, right? You can get around and kind of see how everything fits together. And read our tests too. That's a really good place to understand how these things work. Reading the test code inside of Angular and the CLI is a good place to see how that works.
So yeah, and then that's how to get deeper, and we understand most developers aren't going to do that. But it's definitely there, and it is more approachable than most projects I've seen in my career.
Thanks a lot. So we've got another question asking whether you guys would switch to Webpack instead of System.js. So the person was saying that it seems to get a lot of more traction, but for a starter, a bit more intimidating, maybe.
This is something we've gone back and forth on a lot. I think that pretty much like the last 6 months of my life have been dealing with Webpack and System and all of these tools. That's all I do all day. We should be clear that Angular doesn't really have an official opinion. That is, like, we use System.js in the docs because we can use it in the docs dynamically. We use Webpack in the CLI because it's a comprehensive tool and it's what a lot of people asked for, and it works really nicely. But there's nothing specific to Angular that requires Webpack or System or whatever. And so whatever the next amazing build tool that comes out, and there will be the next amazing build tool, right? Angular should work with it. The old stuff, you can still use that. So it's just a question of what you feel comfortable with. Some people like Webpack, some people hate it, some people like System, some people hate it, and I think that they're all kind of equally valid choices. On the CLI, we took the decision that it was something that we didn't have to re-engineer this entire thing from the ground up, so Webpack was a really good choice. And System is equally good when you don't want to set up all the infrastructure, right? Like if you don't want to have a server and all of this tooling, then System.js is really good for that. So I think there are cases for all the tools, and we work with and talk to all of these teams to make sure that what we're working works with them, and stuff that that they're doing, we know what's coming and what's coming down the pipeline from them.
The standards bodies themselves have not yet finished the specification for how module loading should work. And so as soon as that happens, some changes to all of these tools or more tools or new tools might pop up. And so we really don't want to have a hard tie to any of these. We kind of love all of our children equally from that perspective. And even so far as to with the CLI, while we've adopted Webpack under the hood, all of the CLI commands you use will not be Webpack specific, with the intent, the explicit intent being that Webpack is not part of the CLI kind of API surface or usability surface. So we might at some point in the future switch to something else if it makes development of the CLI easier. But you shouldn't have to change any of your code to make that work.
Thanks. We've got a question from Mo, and Mo's asking, with reference to packaging and bundling, Angular 2 seem it's so difficult to pronounce, unopinionated, and Mo wanted to know if that is correct.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. As I said, we try them all and we play with them all. Part of the issue is that at Google, we use an entirely different set of tools, right? So like we're not using Webpack inside of Google to build our apps. So it's hard for us to say this is the thing you should use. So again, part of my job is validating that what we build works with all the stuff. But we try not to have favorites, I think, in general. I think we probably all have our opinions, but I think that in general, we just want to make sure that all the tools work and so people can choose what they like.
Thanks. Yeah, let's go back to comparing Angular 2 with Angular 1. So in terms of performance, how would you say that it compares, and what helped to make Angular 2 faster?
So I think the number we quote in general, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, is around 4 or 5x in most cases for rendering. Things like lists are 4 or 5x faster to render. How did we do that? It's a complicated question. There are a number of different things. One of the big things is the way that we do change detection now is kind of the biggest internal change between Angular 1 and Angular 2. It's one way, so if you've used React, it's closer to how React does it than how Angular 2 or than Angular 1 does it. That gives us some really nice guarantees when we're doing things like change detection. We can say we're only going to run this once. We have a lot more understanding of what's happening, I think, inside the application. Additionally, you've got more control. So if there are places you want to turn off change detection, if there are places you want to do it incrementally, you can do that. And then really, I think in general, like the underlying, the code generation that we're doing. So that what we actually do with Angular 2 is you write a template and we turn that into instructions. That kind of engineering, I think, is probably under the hood what made the biggest difference in terms of performance. And again, just like 5 years of learning, right? That's the other thing, is that you build a framework once, you see how everybody uses it, right? And then when you get to rebuild it, you can really understand the patterns that people are using and where we can optimize these different things.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few areas or ways that in Angular 1 you could kind of shoot yourself in the foot, so to say, where if you had 1,000 expressions bound on a page or 10,000 expressions bound on a page, and the evaluation of one of those expressions changed something somewhere else, you would end up running this digest loop kind of over and over and over and over and over until things stabilized, which took a ton of CPU and it was very slow. And in Angular 2, this kind of one-directional change detection means that there's no way for you to kind of shoot yourself in the foot in that way anymore, which is kind of very helpful.
Where you do shoot yourself in the foot, Angular 2 will throw warnings at you and say, hey, you're doing something that is likely to shoot yourself in the foot, so don't do that. And that's something that we can't do in Angular 1, that we can do in Angular 2. Angular next generation.
Thanks a lot. Let me just check. Oh, Rob, you mentioned React. We also got quite a few questions asking about Angular 2 compared to React from diverse dimensions such as code maintainability, ecosystem, performance, team speed, and so on. Would you want to talk a bit about this?
Throw them at us. Here we go.
Sorry?
I said throw them at us. Let's begin.
No, it's just in general. If we'd have to speak about Angular 2.
So this is probably like this is the question I probably get asked more than any other question today. And I think that there's, how do we answer this question? So first thing is, I was reading Twitter this morning. The first question was about performance, I think. One of them was Angular 2 and React performance. All the benchmarking we've done shows in most cases we are equal or better to React in most things in terms of perf. And I think that, React and us are leading the pack at the moment, and we'll continue to improve on each other as time goes by. We really, really like TypeScript. I think that's a big advantage that we have today in terms of tooling. There's a much greater TypeScript community than there is the Flow community. I think that the question I ask people sometimes is, what is it you like about React? And I think for a lot of people, that is the things we've mentioned: one-way data flow, Redux, all these things, which work, again, I think, equally well, if not better, in a lot of cases in Angular 2. The other thing is that in general, like, philosophically, Angular is a much larger project than React. We have a router, we have HTTP, we have this entire ecosystem of stuff. We're a much bigger project. React is always very clear that they're very much just a rendering library, right? And I think that it's difficult to compare them one-to-one for that reason.
If I could break in as well, I think that, thanks you, that we actually, I just wanted to touch on what Rob just said, that it's difficult to compare them one-on-one. And I think another aspect of this is, as a team, as the Angular team itself, we try very, very hard to not do these comparisons. So we read them, we see the Twitter feeds of the next latest article that is, comparing either the demise of one or the other. And I think the way that we try to view this is we're all JavaScript developers who both teams, React's team, Angular's team, we're trying to do great things for JavaScript developers around the world, and we learn from each other. We know those teams, we chat with those teams, we try to take the best of each other and present that to the developer world at large versus trying to, take one another out, if you will. So while I think everything Rob said is absolutely great and true, I personally hope that we continue to not do these direct comparisons, because it's also true that we have customers that are using both Angular 2 and React together. And we think that's awesome. And we want to continue to just everybody get along and love each other. And we're all in this JavaScript world together.
We're trying to build the best framework and platform we can.
And I think even in our internal benchmarks, when we're doing testing, things like that, we're typically testing against what you would do if you were writing handwritten JavaScript versus writing React versus Angular. Like, that's not, we're metricing against what's the hard way to do it and how fast can we make it on the easy way, right? And that's typically our metric that we use to benchmark this stuff.
I think a lot of the comparison comes up when a developer is just starting out a new app and they're trying to figure out what sort of framework, what sort of language to use. So the comparisons I've seen usually arises from there. It's not so much, one have to take out the other, but just they're really just trying to figure out what to use. So thank you for talking about this. Can you tell us a little bit about building cross-platform apps using Angular 2? This is something we've seen on Twitter as well.
So yeah, one of the coolest things I think about Angular 2 is in Angular 1, you would always write code that talked directly to the DOM. In Angular 2, what we've done is we've split this apart. So in Angular 2, you write code that talks to Angular, and then Angular sort of handles talking to wherever you're rendering. So that might be the browser, that might be on the server, but it lets us do really interesting things like native script, right? Where you're writing JavaScript, you're going to talk to Angular, and then Angular is going to talk to native code and do native rendering. I think we've really just seen like the beginning of where we can go with this. Web Worker is the other thing we can do. Electron's the other place we can do this, right? So this is very much baked in from the very beginning to Angular's architecture to make sure that we could have this separation between your code and where you're going to render that code. And so I think we'll see more and more and more of that come out over the next few years. You're muted.
We can't hear you. You're muted still, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Joyce, you were talking, right?
Yes, sorry about that. There's a question in the chat saying, is there anything that made it into Angular 2 that you regret? Not sure if there's.
No, I can't think of anything. I can think of one API in the router that I wish we'd done slightly differently, maybe, but like that's it. No, I think we're pretty happy with where it landed.
There's a reason we called it, we shipped 2.0. We were feeling very good about it.
Great. Khalifa is asking in the YouTube chat, can you please share the benchmarking that you've done regarding performance?
Yes, I will tweet it out after this call.
Okay, so follow Rob. He'll tweet it out. Okay.
Just general good advice in life is just follow Rob on Twitter.
Yes. For someone just starting out with Angular, do you have any recommendations regarding whether they should learn Angular 1 first, whether they should start directly with Angular 2? And I've also seen some devs talking about like Angular 2 might be there might be a steeper learning curve. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I think most people should go straight to 2 nowadays. And I think that actually probably the learning curve of Angular 2 is lesser than Angular 1. You've probably, if you're an Angular developer, seen that like famous comic that everybody does of the learning curve of Angular 1. I think that Angular 2 is probably significantly flatter. I think there's probably more tooling to learn in Angular 2, and obviously that's part of why we have the CLI. It's part of what we do a lot of work on tooling. But I think for most people, you should jump straight into Angular 2. The water's really warm, and it's a good time to do it.
Yeah, what I alluded to before is Angular 2 is great for building applications. It takes advantage of kind of the best and the latest of the web as a platform. So using TypeScript or ES6 modules, kind of all of the modern techniques that web developers want and need to use. So I mean, if you want to be a web developer in 2016, you need to learn a framework like Angular 2. Whereas Angular 1 kind of was a reaction to the jQuery, where we needed to take one step forward and take this thing from like doing queries and modifying DOM objects manually into a kind of a first step into an application framework. Angular 2 really extends that. So, I mean, Angular 2 as a framework is actually simpler than Angular 1. We've actually eliminated a bunch of directives. The framework itself kind of has a simpler syntax. There's less kind of to learn, but we're standing on the shoulders of the latest and greatest in terms of what you can do on the web. So there's more web to learn, less Angular to learn if you jumped right into Angular 2.
A good way to put it.
So we also had a question asking for if someone just starting out with Angular 2, they're asking, should I use Firebase or go Meet? So Meet stack.
Either, I think, like in many cases, either. I think that we work really closely with Firebase. I think that both me and Steven really, really love Firebase. I think you just think it's rad, that it's all real time and amazing. That's not like, and it gives you hosting and all this really cool stuff. But again, it depends on your use case. I think that if you just want to get up and running now, Firebase is great, right? The Meet stack is something that, there's a lot of information out there on it, perfectly reasonable way to use it. But of course, if you want to use Java or .NET or whatever, all that stuff works as well, right? But Firebase is really great for, like, I just want to get up and running now and have a really shiny, awesome demo, tomorrow. Firebase is really, really good at that.
Yeah, data is really important to application developers because it's one of the harder things that we try and solve as kind of engineers. And Angular doesn't have a preferred framework. I think we try and have an awesome experience with kind of all of them, whether you just want to make HTTP calls to a custom backend, whether you want kind of observable object and list binding with real-time functionality from something like Firebase and Angular Fire. Or, I mean, there's a lot of kind of new emerging techniques such as GraphQL, which we actually have a really cool integration with, where you can declaratively say, this is the data that I want back, and this is the data I need in each of my components, and then use a tool like Apollo to actually automatically combine those things and do the kind of recursive queries or the nested queries server side, and then you just get back a single chunk of data on the client side, which makes it really easy to just say, I need this data, and then it kind of just magically shows up within your views. So we're trying to make that really, really easy to do.
Thanks. Some people were also asking about the evolution of the component ecosystem. So do you have any thoughts, any things to share regarding this?
I think that it works really well. I think that the fact that basically all the major frameworks have sort of arrived at this pattern, right, is a fairly good indicator that it's a pretty good pattern, both kind of technically and for people's brains. Obviously web components, right, that the same sort of concept, right? Everybody is sort of arriving at this same component concept. I think it works really well. I think probably at Angular's level, we feel like components are the thing, but components don't necessarily equal an application to us. I think that's part of why we have modules. And so like the component module is the ideal module for UI, but I think we probably feel like apps are both UI and model, right? Data, all the other stuff that goes into building apps. And Angular really wants to solve both of those problems, I think.
Thanks. Lucas, who's watching us, asked about advices and tips for beginning a large project. So do you have any best practices, anti-patterns that you could talk about?
Lots of testing early. That's the thing that we see as the #1 anti-pattern people don't do, is testing. So any large project, the more tests you write, the earlier you write them, the easier life gets for the rest of your project, I think.
Another one to jump in here is lazy loading. With the use of ng modules, it's really easy to say, hey, all of this code for my admin section of my website or all this code for my checkout workflow, I don't need any of that code until a user starts doing those actions. And so it's very nice to kind of modularize your application, and then we only load the parts of it that you need. And we take those out of the critical path, so you're not having to load the entire, all of the functions that a user might ever do as part of the first initial load. And then when you combine that lazy loading with things like optimistic module loading or eager lazy loading, we can actually take those things out of the critical path and keep them modularized and separate from a development and maintainability standpoint, but then also have them already on the user's computer before they try and navigate to those routes.
Okay, thank you. So yes, could you also tell us what we could expect next for Angular 2?
So we're having that meeting right now, I think. It's kind of what we're doing this week is everybody's in a room right now very much talking about like what are the features that each, so Angular is divided up into teams. We have kind of our core engineering team, we have a TypeScript team, we have the DevRel team, we've got the material team. And so all of those teams right now are talking about what do we want to do over the next 6 months. The big one from the core team is performance, right? So Angular 2 is very fast today and very small. But because they're mad scientists, the core team think they can go even faster, even smaller. So that's what they'll be focusing on for the next 6 months or so. Material is going to be focusing on material, obviously. I think Steve and I will be focusing on demos and docs and getting out there and talking about it. The mobile team is starting to, and this is where the really kind of more interesting outer projects start to ramp up. So things like mobile and CLI and universal and all of this stuff, we'll start to see them over the next 6 months really kind of finalize, do more interesting things because the core of Angular is done, right? And that's what they've been kind of waiting on. So now that the core of Angular is done, the interesting side projects can start kind of spooling up.
Thanks. Following up on your advice about testing, we got a question asking about what good frameworks are to start with for someone who has to get started with testing.
So we use Karma and Jasmine for pretty much everything. Karma, Jasmine, and Protractor. We use them for everything, so they're pretty well documented. Julie, who works on our team, her GitHub handle is JulieMR. She's got a really, really good starter test project that's set up. It's called the NG2 test seed, I think. So that's a really good kind of place to see it, and that shows you the kind of end-to-end unit testing, all these different things, and how to set up Karma and Protractor. It should be said, though, that like many other things, if you don't like Karma and Jasmine and Protractor, then you could use Jest or Ava or any of their testing frameworks that exist. Probably Karma and Jasmine and Protractor, just because it's sort of officially supported and documented, and there's a huge amount of resource out there already for it.
Great, thank you. Just to add, just a logistical thing, if there are any more audience questions, please do ask them in the YouTube chat. We'll be ending in a few minutes. So there's a question from Mo saying that, I recall once upon a time, the rage was apps for GUI building. With component-based systems like AngularJS, do you imagine this trend rekindled?
Yeah, I think that would be something I would love to see. I was an iOS developer, and I miss drag and drop interface builder sometimes. It'd be really, really awesome to have something like that. We've seen a couple of kind of experimental ideas like this, and we're super interested in them. I don't know that we're going to build one, probably. But if somebody else wants to build one, then absolutely let us know, because we'd love to support you on that.
Great. I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time. So if there are no more audience questions, I just have a last question from our team. Okay. So I guess our team just wanted to know sort of what was your personal favorite feature that made it into this release?
I think for me, probably lazy loading. I think that the router and lazy loading, like if you know the history of Angular 2, the router has been really hard. It's something that it took us a while to get right. It took us a couple of iterations to get right. But I am super, super stoked about where it landed. And I think that it's just incredible. I think it's super easy to use. And the stuff that we do today, we can do lazy loading and, as Stephen said, optimistic preloading, all that good stuff. And that's just the beginning, right? I think there's a huge amount we'll be able to do. So the router, for me, is probably the coolest feature.
I would actually agree with Rob. I mean, lazy loading has been like this dream for years, where it's like, oh yeah, only load the code you need when you need it. But it's been a virtual impossibility for me as a developer to do that, because it's just a ton of work. And the fact that the framework kind of just takes care of it now, I mean, with our Webpack plugin, where it will split your bundle appropriately and things like that, it kind of blew my mind, and it still blows my mind every day, the fact that this just works.
I wrote that code, and it still blows my mind, right? Like,
so I said this at Angular Connect in the keynote, and I remember the day that I found my favorite feature, because I was pretty new to the Angular team, and I kept coming in on Mondays after writing code, and it was the first time I had actually succeeded in actually rendering an app. And I was all excited, and then Igor said, well, you know that you don't just have to render to HTML. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he pointed me to Matthias's, who is one of our engineers, blog post about how Angular 2 has swappable renders. And this excited me, probably not as exciting for Rob or Steven, but I used to be a back-end server-side developer, right? And so a lot of what I've done in my past is not necessarily from a web browser perspective. So I was super stoked to hear that Angular 2 is flexible enough that we can render where there is no DOM. And we've done some projects. Am I blanking on the project that we worked on? Drupal, and things like that, where we can actually do things outside of just a web browser. So that's my favorite feature.
Great.
Thank you. We have one last question from Khalifa on YouTube asking, besides Angular IO, which of course has a lot of resources, do you have any other advice for other sources or resources they can go to?
Follow me on Twitter.
I mean, there actually is a surprising amount of information for JavaScript developers on Twitter. The other thing I would say is we're trying to get better at helping communities self-organize. So there's actually thousands of Angular communities out there across the globe. So kind of wherever you are, there's probably one near you. And one of the things that we're working on internally is helping to find ways to help people find those communities and get connected. So stay tuned on that.
And I should say, real answer as well. Go to the Gitter channel, not the Twitter channel. So go to our Gitter channel. There are like 8,000 really, really helpful people hanging out in there on most days. Some of the core team hangs around in there when we're not too busy. But there's a really amazing group of really amazing people who hang out in there all day and just help people. So definitely check out with them as well.
Great, thank you. If there are no more questions from the audience, Jules, Rob, Steven, did you guys have anything you wanted to add as a last?
I don't think so. Thanks for having us very much. Is there any questions, concerns, feel free to reach out to me or Stephen or Jules. That's why we're here. Beyond that, no, just thanks for having us and enjoy using Angular too.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us. And thank you everyone for watching today. I'll send out an email with the links that Rob mentioned. I'll send out their Twitter handles. You can follow Rob on Twitter. So yeah, that's it for today's office hours. Thank you everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.